We are now moving into a new branch on the animal cladogram, or tree of life. This first branch here, which is our first branch of protostomes, leads us to this big clade known as the Lophotrochozoa. The main evolutionary adaptation that has created this branching in the animal lineage is the evolution of mesoderm. As you will recall, the animals that we have seen up until now are either sedentary or cannot move around very much, or are dependent on using external forces like the currents in the water. And they're mostly filter feeders, relying on the current to carry food to them. But then comes the evolution of mesoderm. And mesoderm leads to the development of something that is an absolute game changer in the animal world: muscles. Muscles allow organisms to be much more active. With the benefit of muscles, animals are no longer dependent on the vagaries of currents to bring their food to them.
With the development of mesoderm, we may in fact be seeing the evolution of the very first active predators. Because one of the consequences of mesoderm is having muscles. And an animal that possesses them can move around much more actively and efficiently in search of their prey. Now, prior to this, the basic body plan was just the two embryonic layers of ectoderm and endoderm surrounding a jelly-like substance, as we saw with the jellyfish and polyps, for example. So now we have the evolution of mesoderm, which is the third embryological layer that gives rise to muscles and organs. Now, this has important consequences on animal evolution because it allows animals to be more active, coordinated, and in a directed manner, compared, of course, to more sedentary animals whose inputs are coming equally from all directions. Whether we're talking about food or sexual partners or predation pressures, these would have been coming at sedentary animals equally from all directions in a 360-degree radius around them.
Which means that the most optimal body form for that type of sedentary organism, like this sea anemone, is a radial symmetry. One within which there's a radius around an axis from the mouth to the other end that we will call the oral aboral axis. By contrast, one of the consequences of having mobility is that all of a sudden there's directionality to life. And that directionality has implications, which is that there's a way forward and a way back. And in this process, it is best to have your sense organs in the front, facing in the direction of travel, in order to more effectively be able to read the environment. Take these clownfish, for example. Unlike those sedentary creatures you see beneath them on this coral reef, the clownfish's sense organs are focused in one region of their body, their head, whether it's to help them seek out mates or food, or to avoid becoming food for another creature. Like this shark, which also has a pretty formidable battery of sense organs located in just the right spot to help it effectively read its environment. That evolutionary process of having the sensory organs concentrated in the head is known as cephalization. Another consequence this would have is in the symmetry of the entire body. Instead of having a radial symmetry, like this sea anemone, all of a sudden, now there's a bilateral symmetry, with a left side and a right side, and a front side and a back side that we call anterior and posterior. The side facing the ground is now the ventral side, and the side facing up to the top is the dorsal side. So now we have bilaterally symmetrical animals, much more active with a head that can seek out and actively interact with their environment. So a consequence of being a bilateral animal is that they can move around and seek out food and mates much more effectively. But there are challenges to this evolutionary change as well, especially in terms of meeting the needs of this new lifestyle. Movement requires more energy, and so there needs to be adaptations in the animal systems to allow access to this greater amount of energy that will be required to support greater levels of activity. One example of this is further ramifications of the digestive system, allowing it to be more effective at extracting nutrients and energy from the diet in order to better fuel that active lifestyle. Another consequence of activity is that it requires a greater sensitivity in terms of the nervous system to enable a creature to coordinate movement and to react to stimulants from the environment. So this would require a much more refined nervous system and well-developed sense organs. Lastly, because diffusion is limited in these bigger and thicker animals, they must also evolve means by which to deliver substances from point A to point B, because diffusion is much slower when it has to pass through thick areas of tissue. As you remember, that the distance a substance needs to travel is inversely proportional to the speed of diffusion according to Fick's law. Another consequence of being more active bilateral animals as a result of getting more food is the need for having more efficient digestion. A further consequence is that animals with larger bodies have an evolutionary advantage that may have contributed to the success of these higher developed animals in evolutionary time. The benefits to being larger are, firstly, that when resources are limited, such as here in the Arctic, they can outcompete other animals, just like this polar bear is able to displace smaller animals and get better access to nutrients and habitats, for example. Secondly, generally speaking, larger animals, such as these elephants, have greater protection against predators, because predators tend to have an easier time catching smaller prey. Therefore, larger prey have an extra degree of protection just due to their body size. Thirdly, larger animals tend to be able to produce more offspring, and that those more offspring will have a selective and adaptive advantage over evolutionary time. So this is not trivial, this evolution of mesoderm, because the consequences of muscularity, of organs, of cephalization, high levels of activity, and development of a larger body size really triggered an evolutionary radiation and the production of many new organisms that take advantage of having this triploblastic body form. So let's just look at a few adaptations that allowed for this active lifestyle, first and foremost in flatworms. The phylum Platyhelminthes have free-swimming flatworms that are essentially grazers that swim around in marine or freshwater environments and collect small items of food, either bacteria or loose organic material that is suspended in the water. And it will do so in a mouth opening through a muscular pharynx that can revert and collect the food. Once the food is brought into the body, there's a highly ramified digestive cavity, and this ramification is one in which the effect is to increase the surface area on the inside, and to promote diffusion of the pre-digested foods that would begin digestion in that digestive cavity due to the secretion of enzymes and acids. So here we would see one form of an example of an adaptation that favors digestive efficiency in order to support the higher energetic and nutritive needs of these new, thicker, and more active animals. Being more active also involves having a more developed nervous system, by contrast with the simpler animals that we've seen before that did not have nerve cords whatsoever, but rather diffuse nerve nets. Here, for the first time, we see the evolution of nerve cords along the length of the body to be able to coordinate muscular movements and activity in a much more coordinated and controlled fashion, allowing for effective active movement. We also see that there are certain ramifications of the nervous system that lead to sense organs in this newly evolved head. In the anterior region of the head, there are two eye spots, which are sensitive to light, allowing them to be able to follow light sources. They're not necessarily able to visualize objects in great detail, but they allow the flatworm to detect variations in light levels, so they know, for example, when they're going closer to the top of the water or closer to the bottom. They also have sense organs on these lobes at the sides of their head, known as auricles, and that these auricles have chemosensory and tactile sensory abilities, meaning that they can essentially smell and touch so they can read the environment more effectively and to seek out food and mates in particular. Many flatworms are marine, in which case their body salt concentration is more or less equivalent to that of the salt water that surrounds them. But that's not the case for freshwater varieties, which will be hypertonic to the water around them because they have a greater concentration of salts and other solutes in their body compared to the freshwater outside. This leads to an osmoregulation problem in which they have to adapt means by which to conserve their salts and avoid the influx of water that would be the natural consequence by osmotic diffusion of water into the body and salts leaving outwards. In these freshwater flatworms, we see the evolution of an osmoregulatory system, which is a series of ducts within the body that extract the accumulated water that is diffused into the tissues from the surrounding environment. In order to concentrate them into these canals and to actively pump that water back out to the outside, which allows them to maintain the appropriate homeostasis and balance of water both within and without the organism. These structures are known as protonephridia, which we will recognize if we think of the etymology. Proto is being like the first nephrons, or an indication that this is very much like the very first primitive kidney that is evolved in animals, and it serves a similar purpose as it does in higher animals like ourselves, such as regulating water and salts in the organism's body. Like most lower animals, flatworms are still capable of undertaking asexual reproduction through processes like binary fission, or splitting into two buds that will grow into full individuals. But there's also the possibility for sexual reproduction as well. Flatworms are also hermaphrodite, or monoecious organisms, meaning they have male and female sex organs. In order to prevent self-fertilization and to promote outcrossing, the sexual maturation usually occurs in a protandrous manner, meaning the male organs are typically ready for reproduction first, and then the female organs develop afterwards. Further on down the evolutionary timescale, descendants of these flatworms began to secrete substances on the dorsal surface that would lead eventually to a protective calcium shell. And this is essentially the basic body plan of mollusks, one of the most successful animal groups with a diversity of nearly 100,000 species. The evolution of mollusks is a successful one in terms of biodiversity, largely because of some of the important adaptations that they brought onto the evolutionary scene. As mentioned, there is this protective dorsal shell. They also evolved gas exchange organs known as gills or ctenidia that increase the efficiency of oxygen extraction from water. And very importantly, there's the evolution of a scraping device in the mouth known as a radula. The radula is essentially like a scraping file that is capable of removing organic material from a substrate. And so, importantly, we note that this is the first organism in animal evolutionary history that has the capability of removing food items from a surface that were not already loose in the environment. Meaning that the animal is not dependent for sustenance on food that just happens to come its way. And so, this clearly opened up a number of ecological niches that allowed mollusks to diversify and to be very successful adaptively because of being able to exploit the nutritional options in the environment much more effectively. So when we think of mollusks, we may think of the most diverse group of them, the gastropods, whose name essentially means a stomach on a foot. If we look at the internal anatomy, it would make sense, given that all the internal organs are all folded on top of one another as an adaptation to fit inside that coiled shell. And all of this is rested on a big muscular foot that uses mucus to slime its way across the surface. We also see increases in digestive efficiency in mollusks due to the fact that they are ingesting larger particles of food because of the scraping ability of the radula. So we see that there is the evolution of various salivary or enzymatic glands in the digestive system, which will promote extracellular digestion, thereby further increasing the breakdown of food particles before they're absorbed into the tissues. As well as large digestive glands that are situated around the stomach in order to further promote this extracellular digestion and to maximize the breakdown and the extraction of nutrients and energy from this new diet of larger particles. Among the mollusks, there's a smaller group that's not very large in terms of biodiversity, but that have some exceptionally interesting evolutionary adaptations. We're talking about the cephalopods, which include octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, and the nautilus. So cephalopods are extremely active predators whose muscular foot has been modified into a series of appendages that act as tentacles and arms that can grab, manipulate, and tear apart their prey using suction cups and hooks all along these arms. Because they're formidable predators, we see that there are a number of adaptations that favor a much higher increase in level of activity and the required energy and nutrients that they need to satisfy this extremely active lifestyle. First and foremost, we note the circulatory system, where blood is pumped through, is equipped with several hearts. There's a systemic heart that pumps the blood through the system of the body, and there are two branchial hearts that pump the blood through the gills. This acts to increase the flow of blood across the gills, which maintains a high concentration gradient, allowing for a maximum diffusion of oxygen into the blood, thereby fueling these animals with great amounts of oxygen to supply the energetic activity. Also, these octopuses and other cephalopods require very well-developed nervous systems in order to allow the highly coordinated and careful management of their hunting activities. So we see that the nervous system among cephalopods is one of the best developed among the invertebrate animals. The cephalopods, in fact, do have a reasonably good-sized brain, which is a big rarity for inverts. The ramifications of their nerve fibers are very well developed into the arms and allow very coordinated control of these movements. But also the sense organs are very well developed, in particular the eyes of the cephalopods. In fact, the cephalopod eye is the best developed animal eye outside of the vertebrates. It is analogous to our eye and functions in essentially the same manner, although it was evolved independently through separate evolutionary lineages. This cephalopod eye, which is essentially like our own, is one in which the light enters through a corneal protective area and is refracted through a lens, focusing the light onto a retinular surface at the back where the pigments will pick up the light stimuli and pass them along the optic nerve to the brain. Now this means, of course, that cephalopods have extremely good vision, and they're capable of using this important sense to their advantage when they're hunting in low light conditions at the bottom of the ocean. The next animal group in our Lophotrochozoa clade are annelids. This includes earthworms and leeches. One adaptation that is clearly seen in annelids is that of segmentation, which in biology is known as metamerism, in which the body is segmented into a number of repeated units, known as metameres. And this confers a huge number of advantages to those metameric organisms. Firstly, we will note that these earthworms and other annelids possess a true coelom or body cavity that is embedded directly into the mesoderm, surrounded by muscle on all sides and separated from one segment to the other by little walls or septa on the inside.
One of the advantages of having a segmented body is it allows for a greater flexibility of movement. And this is because it allows to isolate certain compartments where organs and tissues are not being squished when there's a movement or folding of a body part nearby. Another advantage is it allows the muscular contractions from one part of the body to be successfully isolated from another, such as with this leech that's out for a stroll, looking for its next victim. To illustrate this concept, I'm going to use this trusty balloon. So for example, what do you think would happen in this unsegmented animal if there was a muscular contraction in this part of the body? Well, let's see. We squeeze in this part of the body, and lo and behold, that muscular contraction sends the forces all the way to the other end of the body, and therefore this isn't a very good mechanism for isolating muscular contractions in one portion of the body. So now that we have this fully segmented animal, watch what happens when we do the same thing. We apply a muscular contraction to one subunit of the animal, and we note that the muscular forces remain isolated in that subunit and are not transferred to other parts of the body. So this makes it much more effective for isolating muscular contractions and doing work for that animal.
The effect of metamerism on body movements in earthworms allows them to undertake a very particular form of locomotion or moving around, which is known as peristaltic locomotion, where they can alternate contractions of longitudinal muscles and radial muscles. This will cause it to bulge and stretch in various different parts of the animal, allowing it to crawl its way along the ground or to burrow its way into a hole. Using fine little hairs or seta that it has on the side of its body to anchor itself, while it's sort of wriggling those squished balls and lengthened segments down into the ground. Now, of course, any coordinated movement would require a well-developed nervous system. And in the segmented metameric animals, like Fred here, there's a ventral nerve cord all the way along the body that has extensions that reach up and ramify in order to innervate all the various muscles and organs and all the things along the way. The ventral nerve cord is also segmented with ganglia, which is basically a word that means a mass of nerve cells, kind of like a mini brain, but not big enough to be a brain on its own. So we can interpret this as being similar to having a tiny little brain in each segment along the metameric or repeated segments of the body of annelids. There's another degree of repetition in these segments, including with respect to osmoregulation and excretion, in which we have a further adaptation of the protonephridia into metanephridia, meaning after that first nephron, in which the fluid that circulates in the coelom cavities is filtered through a series of tubes in order to extract digestive wastes from that fluid that would be toxic to the organism, and to excrete them to the outside, all while maintaining a balance of the proper homeostasis of water and salts in the system. So there's this repetition of each of these units along the body in each segment, and this repetition also allows a certain amount of redundancy, where if one segment is not working so well, the other segments can pick up the slack. Also, as any anglers out there will have noted in the past, earthworms are largely capable of regenerating parts of their bodies when certain other parts have been cut off. And this is because they have multiple copies of all of the units on the inside. So if I were to slice a few segments off of old Fred here, losing a few segments might not be as catastrophic as all that for him. Fortunately for Fred, mutilation is not covered in his contract. In terms of gas exchange in annelids, they have very thin skin and live in aquatic or humid environments, and their main source of gas exchange is just passive diffusion through the skin. In order to facilitate this, there's a circulatory system that has a series of hearts. The blood is pumped through vessels, but these vessels are linked from the dorsal and ventral side via a number of capillaries on the inside. Now, capillaries are very small forms of the circulatory vessels that, due to their small size, increase the surface area with respect to the volume and promote a high degree of diffusion. So here we're seeing an evolutionary adaptation in the circulatory system to favor diffusion for respiration, and the development of capillaries at a site where there's a high degree of gas transfer at the skin in these particular organisms. That's one of the reasons why they need to stay in humid environments, because if their skin were to dry out, the gas exchange would stop and they'd suffocate. So, in conclusion, the development of mesoderm leads to a huge number of consequences.
In particular, we point to the development of a head where sense organs are located, but also the presence of muscles allow animals to be much more active and bigger, which then in turn requires systems on the inside to satisfy the needs of these more active, thicker, and bigger bodies. So if you have to get up after this episode and stretch out your legs, you have the evolution of mesoderm to thank for that.
But if you keep leeches in your dorm room, remember to put a lid on that container, because these guys make good use of their mesoderm, and they do like blood.